I'm Nima Rajan. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the federal government is ramping up delivery of rapid tests to the provinces. This comes as tests run scarce across the country and access to molecular tests has been restricted. Health Minister Jean-Yves Duclos says 140 million tests will be distributed in January on a per capita basis. Mr. Trudeau says that is triple the number that provinces received in December. In its last fiscal update, the government earmarked $1.7 billion to secure a supply of about 180 million rapid tests. The Prime Minister also confirmed there are enough vaccine doses in Canada for everyone in the country to get their booster. Mr. Duclos says that there will be enough child-sized doses for all kids aged 5 to 11 this month. Much of Western and Central Canada was a sea of red this morning on Environment Canada's public alert map. Extreme cold warnings in much of the country range from -20 wind chills in BC's north and central coast to -50 in BC's northeast. And there are winter storm warnings for most of southern BC and Vancouver Island. Most of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba also remain under extreme cold warnings, with biting wind chills ranging between -40 and -50. Canada and the U.S. are each claiming victory after arbitrators issued their final report into American complaints about dairy imports. U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai formally requested a dispute settlement panel last May. It was to examine allegations from American dairy producers that Canada is denying them fair access to the Canadian market. The ruling says Canada unfairly favors Canadian processors. But Canada's Trade Minister, Mary Ng, says the ruling is otherwise overwhelmingly in favor of Canada's dairy industry. Well, yesterday's virtual news conference held by lawyers and family of victims of the Iranian military's downing of a passenger jet 2 years ago was derailed by hackers. An Ontario court awarded over $107 million to Canadian families of 6 victims of the January 8, 2020 incident. The Zoom news conference exploded with music and explicit images. Cinemas, gyms, theaters, and restaurants across Ontario must close for indoor activities starting today as stricter COVID-19 measures take effect. Retail stores and personal care services are limited to 50% capacity. The province says students will go back to remote classes until at least January 17th. The Toronto Zoo says it is opting to close temporarily starting today in order to ensure it can maintain critical staffing levels for animal care and infrastructure maintenance. BC's top doctor says businesses should prepare to have as many as 1/3 of their employees off sick with the Omicron variant. Dr. Bonnie Henry says businesses that require staff to come into the workplace need to use multiple safety protocols. This includes staggering shifts and break times and using plexiglass barriers. Dr. Henry says BC's testing capacity has been limited, with 80% of new infections due to Omicron. The former Premier of Nova Scotia, Ian Rankin, is resigning as leader of the provincial Liberal Party. The 38-year-old says he intends to continue as leader until the party holds a leadership race. But he also intends to focus on his family. Mr. Rankin served as Premier of the province for just over 6 months before losing a summer election to the Progressive Conservatives. Mr. Rankin says he accepts responsibility for the election loss. Manitoba's new Premier, Heather Stefanson, says she replaced a former cabinet minister because of his comments on COVID-19 vaccines. Ron Schuler was removed from his cabinet post last week as Minister for Infrastructure and Emergency Measures. He had refused to discuss his vaccination status. Premier Stefanson said all of her caucus members had met a requirement to be fully vaccinated by December 15th. A day after the deadline, Mr. Schuler said he is not against vaccines, that people should listen to their doctor, and the decision comes down to individual rights. Well, turning to Alberta, which is dealing with its highest active case count of COVID-19 infections since the pandemic began. In a COVID-19 update, Premier Jason Kenney says there are more than 34,000 active cases in Alberta and 436 COVID patients in hospital. But Mr. Kenney admits the actual count of COVID-19 cases in Alberta is likely much higher than provincial data shows. He and the province's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw, expect hospitalizations will rise in the weeks ahead. Halifax is now one of the fastest growing cities in Canada. Recent statistics indicate the historic port city is on its way to having a population of 500,000 people in less than 5 years. All right, stay tuned. We'll have more news from around the world shortly after the break on Forum Daily News. We'll be right back. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said he'll hold a call with premiers next week to discuss how governments are keeping citizens safe. This comes as surging cases of the Omicron variant of COVID-19 force provinces to postpone non-urgent surgeries and reduce access to COVID-19 tests. Meanwhile, the fast-moving Omicron variant is complicating a key question. How does the COVID-19 pandemic end and the world coexist with this virus? Experts seem to agree that the coronavirus itself is here to stay and that Omicron is likely not the last mutation. However, at some point, it is expected that different parts of the world, probably at different times, will tamp down the virus enough to consider it like any other of the health threats we live with. Well, joining us now to give us a look into how the virus may evolve in our weekly medical segment is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Apple Tree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's start with a brief review of how the coronavirus has mutated over the course of the pandemic.
Well, it's 2022, and over the past few months, we have unfortunately learned quite a bit of the Greek alphabet, from Alpha now to Omicron. Alpha, as we know, was the first highly publicized variant. It appeared in Great Britain in November of 2020, and infections really surged around that time. It was about 30 to 50% more contagious than the original coronavirus, and also had a high mortality rate. At the same time, we also talked about Beta variant, which was identified in South Africa at the end of 2022. It was also found to be very contagious compared to the original strain, but we really didn't have a big impact with Beta in Canada specifically. Delta is the variant that we've heard about the most at this point, first identified in India in late 2020. It spread throughout the world, becoming the predominant version until Omicron. But the Delta variant still exists. It's still very concerning. It's estimated to be 90% more transmissible than the Alpha variant, and Delta has caused significant severe disease more than Alpha. Which really brings us today in Omicron. There's still a lot to learn about Omicron. It was identified in Botswana and South Africa in November of 2021, and we had a lot of cases that came about in the past few months. It seems to be far more transmissible than even Delta, but the evidence points it may not be as severe.
Now, this is a very active virus, Dr. Raut. Why does this virus continue to mutate like this?
Right, so viruses are constantly changing. Their genetic code is really prone to changes called mutations that can affect how a virus looks or affects its host. Viruses do rely on a host to survive and replicate. So they invade the body of a human in this case, and then their own genetic material or RNA enters the cells, and that code can sometimes be not so perfect, and we call that a mutation, and they happen quite frequently.
And it's interesting that the Omicron variant can surpass those who are double vaccinated. So how is the virus able to do this?
Well, most of the time when the mutations occur, there really are of no consequence. One adjustment doesn't really change the protein configuration of the virus. These small changes, we call them drifts, minor alterations there. But what's consequential are shifts, major changes in the structure of a virus. If a virus keeps mutating, it accumulates different mutations. It then would be a major shift, and it responds differently to treatments, becomes less recognizable to the antibodies, and that way even natural infection or vaccination is decreased.
All right, Dr. Raut, well, now as we're being advised to get booster doses, how likely are we to see other variants that can impact the triple vaccinated?
That's very true. I remember most of the mutations being of minimal consequence. There are still many variants of coronavirus that we don't quantify as variants of concern. I think it's certainly possible, but unlikely, that we'll see a variant that may neutralize even triple vaccinated individuals' immunities.
And what about herd immunity, Dr. We talked a lot about this last year. Can herd immunity eventually help us to be able to live and coexist with this virus?
Herd immunity is key here. If the individual doesn't have proper immunity, the virus can enter the person, replicate more and cause more mutations and then more variants. If you have strong immunity, let's say from triple boosting, it's very difficult for the virus to replicate, as the immune system will just kill it off before it reaches that state. So once we have enough people with herd immunity from boosters or even from infections, we'll expect that the virus will not be able to replicate and spread as much. And then that'll cause a nice drop in the morbidity and mortality we are unfortunately seeing.
All right, Dr. Rad, a quick 30 seconds left here, but any last messages to our viewers who may be frustrated with newly introduced restrictions?
Fair enough. I mean, in the past 2 years, we have seen more than 5 million lives lost, billions affected there, and everyone does have the sensation of fatigue and deja vu. To them, I say, stay strong. You are not alone. And in the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, even if you're not ready for the day, it cannot always be night.
Dr. Rad, always great having you. Thank you again.
Thanks so much.
As Canadian taxpayers start off the new year, they will have to contend with rising taxes in a number of areas. This is according to a new report by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The 2022 New Year's Tax Changes report says there will be changes to income taxes, carbon taxes, property taxes, and more. The report notes that despite the ongoing pandemic, there will be increases to EI and CPP contributions. Franco Terrazzano, the federal director of the CTF, says if you're making more than $40,000 a year, you'll see your federal income tax bill go up thanks to rising payroll taxes. Well, with us to unpack the findings in this report is Mr. Franco Terrazzano himself. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on.
So what are some of the key takeaways from the New Year's Tax Changes report, sir?
The key takeaway is that if you're making more than $40,000, expect to see your federal income tax bill going up because of those payroll taxes. But the pain doesn't end there for taxpayers in the new year. You're going to see higher carbon tax, higher booze taxes, even higher property taxes in many big cities in Canada. And really, this is the worst possible time for politicians to be reaching deeper into our pockets. Many Canadian families are struggling with these higher prices, but we also have to remember that many people lost their job, took a pay cut, maybe even lost their small business during this pandemic. So we should be seeing taxes going down, not up.
All right, Mr. Terrazzano, let's define what exactly payroll taxes are for our viewers.
Well, those are the mandatory payments that you have to pay into the Canada Pension Plan, that you have to pay into employment insurance. So this year, expect to pay about $953 into EI. That's a $63 increase this year. But for CPP, expect to pay about $3,500, which is a $333 increase this year.
All right, sir, and taking a look at the federal tax changes, besides the carbon tax and fuel regulations, what are the other major changes we should look for?
Well, let's talk about that carbon tax increase this year. So the carbon tax is increasing for the third time during the pandemic on April 1st of this year to 11 cents per liter of gasoline. But Trudeau's not going to stop his carbon tax hikes there. He wants to continue increasing his carbon tax until 2030, when that carbon tax will be nearly 40 cents per liter of gasoline. So just talk about Canadian drivers getting soaked.
All right, sir. And your report also notes that the alcohol escalator tax will rise. So what exactly is an escalator tax, and why should our viewers care about it?
Well, what that means is that taxes on our booze continue to go up year after year after year. So if you had a hard day at the job, maybe your kids are driving you nuts and you just want to settle back with a 6-pack or maybe enjoy that bottle of wine with your wife or your husband. Well, politicians are reaching deeper into your pockets there. Right now, taxes make up about 50% of the price of beer, about 65% of the price of wine, and about 75% of the price of spirits.
And I came across another interesting term in your news release for this report called bracket creep. What does this term mean, sir?
Well, bracket creep is such a sneaky backdoor form of income taxes, and it happens when politicians stop moving tax brackets with inflation, and inflation can automatically bump taxpayers into higher tax brackets, even though what we can afford to buy hasn't actually gone up. Now, provinces like Alberta, Nova Scotia, PEI, and even some tax brackets in Ontario are seeing their paychecks reduced because of bracket creep. In Ontario, for example, bracket creep can cost a taxpayer up to $132 this year.
All right, sir. Well, taking a look at the provincial level, are there any notable changes we should look out for when it comes to individual provinces?
Well, bracket creep is the big one, as we just discussed for some of these provinces. But we also have to talk about municipalities. We can't let these councillors and mayors off the hook either, because there's many big cities where you're going to be seeing property tax increases in 2022. And these are so damaging. Just think of a few examples. Let's say you own a small business, maybe a gym or a restaurant. You may have seen your revenue evaporate, but you might still have to pay this big property tax bill. Or let's say during the pandemic, you may have lost your job. You may have took a pay cut. Well, you open that mailbox and there's a big property tax increase waiting for you there from your city councillors.
All right, Mr. Terrazano, about 45 seconds left here, but do taxpayers have any positive tax changes to look forward to at the federal or provincial level?
There's just a little nugget in there for us. Fortunately, the federal government is increasing the tax-free portion of our income. So you're going to save about $89 there. But those savings are really dwarfed by the higher payroll taxes that you're also going to be paying that we talked about.
All right, sir, just a quick 30 seconds left here, but where can our viewers go to read this full report?
Well, you can find that at taxpayer.com. Just head over to our newsroom and you'll have all the information there.
All right, Mr. Franco Terrazano, Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always great having you on Forum Daily, sir. Thank you again for your time.
Hey, my pleasure, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Health authorities across the United Kingdom have eased COVID-19 testing requirements. The move is designed to help tackle staffing shortages that are hitting public services amid an Omicron-fueled surge in infections. The change was announced on Wednesday. The UK Health Security Agency says that from January 11th, people in England who test positive using a rapid lateral flow test will no longer need to confirm the result with a PCR test if they have no symptoms. Authorities in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are making the same change. French President Emmanuel Macron has provoked outrage in Parliament and protests from election rivals. This was by using a vulgarity to describe his strategy for pressuring vaccine refusers to get coronavirus jabs. He said in an interview, quote, "The unvaccinated, I really want to bug them." Mr. Macron used a word in French that means to rile or to bug. His use of earthy language immediately complicated the already difficult passage in Parliament of the government's planned new vaccine pass. Sweden has created an agency to combat disinformation as the country approaches a general election in September. The Swedish Psychological Defense Agency started up on January 1st. It didn't name any countries that it suspects of participating in disinformation campaigns. France has a presidential election in April, and the country set up an agency last year to combat foreign disinformation and fake news. Germany's antitrust watchdog has paved the way for extra scrutiny of Google by designating it as a company of, quote, paramount significance. It's the first such decision since regulators got more power to curb abusive practices by big digital companies. And it's the latest example of how tech companies are facing more pressure over concerns that their dominance stifles competitions and hurts consumers. Google isn't appealing the decision and says it is confident that it complies with the rules. Well, a year after pro-Trump rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol, hundreds of people who assaulted officers and committed other crimes still haven't been caught. The investigation into last January's insurrection has been a massive undertaking for U.S. federal law enforcement officials. More than 700 people have been charged with federal crimes stemming from the January 6th attack. But 250 people seen on video assaulting police at the Capitol still haven't been fully identified and apprehended by the FBI. Another 100 are being sought for other crimes tied to the riot. Local news reports say demonstrators, angered by rising fuel prices, have stormed the presidential residence and mayor's office in Kazakhstan's largest city. News reports say both buildings have been set on fire. The intensifying protests led the Central Asian country's government to resign. Many Kazakh news sites became inaccessible, while the global internet monitor NetBlocks says the country was experiencing a widespread internet blackout on Wednesday. Israel's defense minister has met with the King of Jordan. The meeting in the Jordanian capital, Amman, on Wednesday comes as part of a reset of ties between the two countries. Defense Minister Benny Gantz's office said the two discussed security and policy topics, while a statement from King Abdullah II said the Palestinian issue was also discussed. Israel and Jordan made peace in 1994 and maintained close security ties. But relations soured in recent years, including over tensions at a Flashpoint Jerusalem mosque. The U.S. military says North Korea has fired a ballistic missile into the sea. This is its first weapons launch in about 2 months. The launch came after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un vowed to further strengthen his military capability without disclosing any new policies toward the United States or South Korea at a high-profile ruling party conference last week. Officials in Ethiopia have arbitrarily detained and forcibly disappeared thousands of ethnic Tigrayans who were recently deported from Saudi Arabia. This comes in a new Human Rights Watch report as the country's deadly Tigray conflict continues. This is the latest report citing witnesses who have described mass arrests of ethnic Tigrayans. Ethiopia's government says it is targeting people suspected of supporting the Tigray forces. Thousands of Ethiopians travel each year to Saudi Arabia in search of a better life. But Saudi officials have deported thousands of them in recent years. A German shepherd named Tinsley became an unlikely hero in New Hampshire this week. First thought to be a lost dog, the animal successfully led state police to the site of its owner's rollover crash on Monday night. Both the vehicle's occupants were seriously hurt and quickly received medical assistance. Thanks to Tinsley's efforts and unspoken follow me mannerisms, officers found the victims. Well, Tinsley's definitely a good boy. All right, take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.